Okay, my computer's going to be a little slow because it's still converting the lecture. In fact, we're only 71% done with the lecture file. Before we begin, are there any questions? All right, let me share my screen here. There we go. 74% done now. Like I said, that'll take a little while before it finishes, so my computer's going to be really slow until that time. Let's see if I can shut that down. Nope. All right, can't do that. I think I need that now. All right, I don't need to talk further about the web page, but do let me remind you that week one lab follows week one lecture, and that the web page, the Canvas page, is set up mostly by weeks. Let's go to the schedule in the syllabus. For today, we're going to talk about Lab 00. That's January 6th. Lab safety training. Worksheet Lab 00 is due by 8 a.m. Friday, January 9th. And the same with Lab 01, as well as the environmental quiz. If you do not turn in the two worksheets, Lab 00 and Lab 01, by 8 a.m. Friday, you will be dropped from the class. Any question about any of that? So let me remind you, you need to finish the environmental quiz by 8 a.m. Friday, and you need to finish both online plagiarism quizzes by 11:59 p.m. on Saturday, January 10th. You must achieve 100% on both plagiarism quizzes, otherwise you'll get 0 on the infectious disease project, which is a 100-point project. Any question about any of that? If not, let's move to the syllabus. Talk a little bit about the syllabus that's referring to directly the lab. We'll always be having the lab from 6:30 to about 8 o'clock Zoom sessions. And to my knowledge, I'm the only one at Clark College who, at least in the microbiology lab, actually sits in the lab while your students are working on the lab to answer questions. So you only need to attend the lab or review the session from when I'm talking about the lab. But after that, if you're through and you want to work on the lab later, or you just don't want to work on the lab and ask me questions, you can log off the lab. I will stay until 8 o'clock to answer any questions or until the last student logs out. Once the last student is logged out from the lab, I too will log out. So if you have a question, make sure you ask it before the last student is logged out so that I'm still around to answer your question. But I do stay at the lab to help students with the lab and to answer any questions. Any question about any of that? And I did mention that oftentimes students, when they want an office hour, we can have it during the lab if you don't mind another student or students listening, or we can wait until all other students log off to have the meeting, and I can then stop the recording so that your office hours would be private. And when somebody ever logs in, we will be notified. So there'll be a bing and you'll see somebody show up in the class. So uh, we could stop the meeting. So that's often what I do. Another thing is to have the office hours after the lab, just because it's convenient. We're both available. Going through the syllabus topics I need to discuss for the lab that I haven't already discussed. I mean, obviously, some topics are important. You can't cheat, you can't plagiarize in the lab either. The grading we've already discussed. I mean, it's important, but I'm not going to discuss it again. Microscopes used in the lab. We're going to be working all online, so you're not ever going to actually use a microscope in this class. However, you will be expected to name the parts of microscopes and use a microscope, even though we're not really going to be using one. And you also need to know how to take care of a microscope, clean it and put it away. We will have a virtual lab using a virtual online microscope, which will give you some familiarity with using a real microscope. Labs and safety rules. We have rules for in the lab to keep everyone safe. The lab safety rules will be described in detail in the first week of class, meaning this lesson, and we're going to not physically meet, but you do need to learn about lab safety protocols because safety is one of the main skills that many nursing programs want students to learn. The attitudes and actions of people working in the lab determine the level of safety. So develop a positive and respectful attitude towards microorganisms. Never take shortcuts which risk safety and accuracy. Follow these rules. I won't threaten you if you don't follow the rules because you won't really be in a lab. All right. You're not allowed to take personal items into a real microbiology lab and take them to the lab bench. Everything you have must remain in your bag and put in a space provided for bags and coats and books, which we call the cubicle. All required equipment, paper, pens, will be provided for you. And anything provided for you must remain in the lab, and everything of your own personal belonging, your books and your cell phone and your purse if you have a purse and your well, not your wallet, but your coat, for example, would be put in the cubby hole. The cubby hole, as well as the door of the microbiology lab, is considered outside the microbiology lab. Any question about that? So, yes, when you first walk inside the building, the classroom for the microbiology lab, you're not physically yet inside the lab because the door and the cubbyhole, the cubicle, is considered outside the lab. You then walk a few more feet into the lab, and now you've entered the lab proper. And anything inside the lab should stay inside the lab, should not go out unless it's been treated or sterilized. And anything coming into the lab should, anything brought to the lab, I'll word it that way, should stay in the cubbyhole and should not be exposed to microorganisms. Any question about any of that? All right, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Only enrolled microbiology students are permitted in the lab unless authorized by the instructor. Additional items, including your book bag, your books, cell phones, coats, must be put in the cubicle, which is considered outside the lab, even though it's inside the room. That region of the lab is considered outside the lab proper. Personal items must be kept there and not brought to the lab, inside the lab. And you should never access the cubicle when you have your lab coat and your gloves on. What you should do is remove those, wash your hands, and then go to your personal items in the cubicle. And that way you'll prevent microorganisms from getting on your stuff. How do you take notes in the lab? What you do is you write your notes on the paper in the lab with the paper and the pencil provided for you in the lab, or the pen in the lab. And then you take a digital photo of it and email it to yourself. And now you have your notes on email, which if you really wanted to, you could go someplace like home and print it out if you wanted a hard copy. Cell phone usage in the lab is prohibited. If you get a phone ringing in the lab, you need to take off your gloves, take off your lab coat, go to the sink, wash your hands, walk over to where the cubicle is, and that's actually outside the lab now. Go grab the phone, take it outside the door, answer the phone, probably call the person back because the phone won't be ringing after all that time, and answer the phone. When you're done talking on the phone, put the phone back in your book bag, go to the sink, wash your hands, go put on your lab coat, put on gloves, go back to working in the microbiology lab. And that's what you need to do. Now, we do have a phone for your use, like in an emergency inside the lab. You do not need to remove the gloves or your lab coat to call out of that phone. It'd be very hard for anyone to call in, but if someone were to call in, you could answer the phone and not take off your gloves. Any questions about any of that? That phone is only for emergency purposes. Like, I don't know, someone maybe who has a significant other who's pregnant and she's going into labor and she sends you a text message, you want to call them, you can go use that lab phone. Something like that. That's what the lab phone's for. If prohibited items are taken into the lab, they will be confiscated for safety reasons, and they will not be returned to you until they've been autoclaved or cleaned in a bucket of bleach. This will destroy a cell phone. You are allowed to take some personal items into the lab if you are wearing them, such as jewelry, a watch, and your own eyeglasses or hearing aids. You should not touch these items while you're in the lab, especially when you have gloves on, but you are allowed to take them into the lab. Any question about any of that? All other personal items should be put in your book bag or the cubbyhole and just left there until you're ready to leave. So, like I stated, for where is that here? For coming into the lab, you put your things in the cubicle. You then go walk over to the sink. This is now inside the lab proper. Wash your hands, dry your hands, go put on your lab coat, which is kept in the lab, and then go put on gloves. We do have gloves available for you in the lab. And then go to your workstation. You should clean the work area with disinfectant before you begin work. And then when you're all done for the day, you clean your work area again with disinfectant. And if you're ready to leave, go take off your gloves. If there's, I'll talk about that later. Um, take off your lab coat, go over to the sink, wash your hands, and then walk over to the cubicle. Now you've left the lab proper. Go grab your books, and then you can leave the door to leave the lab. Any question about any of that? So that's the proper you'd do each day when you come into the lab, and then the proper procedure for leaving the lab as well. While you're in the microbiology lab, you must wear closed-toed shoes at all times, meaning you can't wear sandals, you can't wear a lady's fancy shoe that's open at the toe, you can't wear uh, thongs on your feet. Lab coats are required. You must have them completely buttoned whenever you're in the lab. Lab coats can be provided by the microbiology lab. You can also buy one from the bookstore. If you do buy one from the bookstore, you should put your name on it, bring it to the first class, bring it into the lab, and leave it in the lab. Once it's been in the lab, you leave it in the lab until the very end of the term. At the end of the term, you would then bring it up to me on a hanger. I'd put it in a place where it will then be autoclaved, washed, and then it'll be put out available for you to pick up in between terms, usually outside the microbiology lab. So once you buy a lab coat, you only bring it into the lab one time. It never leaves the lab unless you want to keep the lab coat, in which case you give it to me, the instructor, for treatment, and it will be first be autoclaved and then washed, dried, and then hung up so you could pick it up after the end of the term. So it only leaves the lab really one time. Any question about any of that?
Okay, really quick question. So we do wear the lab coat once we get into the lab. We don't put it on before, and it stays in the lab.
The lab coats, most students get them from the microbiology lab, meaning from us, in which they should go find a lab coat that fits them, and they then put it on and they use it for the lab. And then when they want to leave the lab, they will take it off and leave it in the lab. And so that lab coat never leaves the lab. It will be sterilized in the autoclave and then washed in between terms, but it will then be made available for students next term. If you do buy a lab coat, you only bring it into the lab the first day, first lab, and it stays in the lab all the time until actually after the end of the term, in which case you can then pick it up and then take it home after it's been sterilized and washed.
Got it.
Okay? Some
So are we,
students don't want the lab coat, in which case they can leave it. And I imagine that's how we eventually got all the lab coats, but I'm not sure. And somebody had a question?
Yeah, so are we going over this just to know like all the like rules and all the like safety practices of the lab for the quiz, or are we actually going to a lab this term?
You're not going to a lab this term, but you do need to know these rules for the quizzes.
Oh, okay.
Okay? So lab coats are stored in the lab for the duration of the lab. The exception is only if you bought a lab coat and you want to take it home, you can bring it into the first lab, and then after the end of the term, you can come and pick it up and take it home. Goggles are required in the lab anytime we're working with a broth or a splash hazard. A broth is a liquid culture where there's microorganisms growing in it, and you have to wear goggles to protect your eyes from the cultures in the liquid culture, as well as from splash hazards. Like when we're working with the gram stain I think it's the crystal violet dye, can be hazardous if you're to get it in your eyes, and so you have to wear goggles for that. Generally, we don't have too many splash hazards, but obviously we work with liquid cultures, in which case you have to wear goggles in the lab. Anytime you're not working with a liquid culture, or when there's no splash hazard, you do not need to wear goggles, which is most of the time if you are actually going to go into a microbiology lab. Cleanliness is a virtue in microbiology. As I already stated, let me repeat it. Oops, I just lost my place. Darn it. I went down and it didn't work. So you disinfect your own lab bench with disinfectant before you begin work, and then before you leave the lab, after you're doing your work in the lab, before you leave. You also always wash your hands before you come to your workstation in the lab, meaning when you first walk into the lab, and then after you leave, once you go, take off your gloves, take off your lab coat, hang it up, go walk to the sink and wash your hands. You should know we have a fire extinguisher, a fire blanket, an eye wash station, and first aid materials in the lab. You don't need to know where they are because we're never going to go to a lab. Accidents should be reported to the instructor. Minor accidents should be cleaned as follows. First, always clean broken glass. Broken glass can cut skin, and glass can be contaminated with numerous microorganisms. It can easily cut through your gloves. So always handle broken glass with a brush and a dustpan, or a broom and a dustpan. Dispose of the broken glass in the broken glass receptacle. Spilled acids and bases should be diluted and wiped up quickly. Spilled bacterial cultures should be cleaned as follows. Cover the spilled material with lots of paper towels. Drench the paper towel with disinfectant. Let the disinfectant sit for 15 minutes. Then wipe up the area with clean paper towels. If there's broken glass, pick that up with well, first pick up the paper and the on top of it and discard the paper in the biohazard container, and then go and pick up the broken glass using the dustpan and the broom or brush. Put the broken glass in the broken glass container. Wipe up the mess with dry paper towels. If there's a biohazard, meaning if there's a culture bacteria that were in it, put the paper towels in the biohazard container. Don't put the glass in the biohazard container. No glass should ever go in the biohazard container, even if it's unbroken glass. Broken glass should go in the broken glass container. Few other rules. Be sure to keep hair and paper away from Bunsen burners and back to incinerators. We have hair ties. Tie your hair back if it's long. You should turn off back to incinerators and Bunsen burners before you leave the lab. Actually, for gas, you should turn it off whenever it's not being used. With a back to incinerator, turn it off if you're not going to use it for a long period of time, like a half an hour. But if you're going to use it within an hour, leave the back to incinerator on because it will take 5 minutes to warm up. Mouth pipetting is not allowed. Never take cultures out of the labs. Samples can only be brought into the lab after getting authorization by the instructor. So you have to get permission and authorization. If you have a cut on your hand, you should wash your hands in the normal way. go to the first aid kit, apply a Band-Aid, and then put a glove over your hands or over the Band-Aid. And then go at the end of the day, take off your gloves, go wash your hands. If you want, you can go over to the first aid kit and put on a fresh Band-Aid. All microbial cultures must be labeled completely in the lab with your name or initials, the date, the nature of the specimen, and the medium used. Old specimens must be discarded properly in the following ways. Agar plates, which are always plastic, are discarded in the biohazard container if they contain microorganisms. If they do not contain microorganisms and you want to toss them, you can put them in the trash can. Any paper towels that do not have microbes on them can be put in the trash can. Any plastic pipette which is discarded can be put in the trash can if there's no microorganisms on them. Paper towels and pipettes, plastic pipettes, can be put in the biohazard container if they have microbes on them. Glass pipettes should be put in a separate place with the labeled container pipettes. Glass test tubes should be put in a separate place with the place where we put the test tubes, which is in the test tube rack. You should remove any tape from the test tubes and put them in there. And you don't need to worry about them after that. The lab people will come and grab those test tubes. They will autoclave them and then wash them, clean them, and make them available for use for other students. Pipettes, the same thing. You don't need to clean them. You just put them in the glass pipette container, and they will be taken by the lab people. Let me see, what do? They probably autoclave them and then wash them. Likely they sterilize them, put them in a container, sterilize them, and then make them available for further use. Supplies needed for the lab will be in the front of the lab. Each pair of students is assigned a drawer under their lab bench. Assigned drawers contain lab supplies for your use during the term. Please do not use supplies from other people's drawers. You may store things in your assigned drawer as well. There's no ability to lock the drawers, so don't leave valuables in these drawers, as well as anything brought into the drawer or into the lab has to stay there until it is either autoclaved or put into a bucket of bleach, and then it can be taken out of the lab. You're required to follow these rules. You'll need to know them for the quizzes. You don't really need to know them for coming into the lab because we're not going to come into the lab. Any question about the safety rules? All right, let's shut down the syllabus. I suppose I should save it. I think I did change the quizzes. Let's talk about Lab Module 00, Laboratory Safety, which you can get right there. And then we'll talk about worksheet for Lab 00. You're not going to be working in the lab, but you do need to know this material, as many of these rules will be relevant during your career. You need to also know the material for the quizzes. Learning objectives. 1. Distinguish between safe and unsafe laboratory practices. 2. Understand where relevant safety equipment is located in the lab. You actually only need to know what the relevant safety equipment is. You don't need to know where it's located. And then three, understand how to safely dispose of contaminated materials. Microbiologists observe a number of safety rules as they're working with potentially pathogenic microorganisms. While you're not going to be actually performing these activities in the lab, because everything we do will be done online, it is important for you to understand the guidelines required to create a safe laboratory environment, and you will be tested on this information. So you must wear proper attire, a clean lab toque covering your lap. It must be buttoned. You must wear disposable gloves, shoes that fully enclose the foot, goggles whenever there's a splash hazard. Most of the time there will not be a splash hazard, but if ever you're working with the liquid culture, meaning a broth culture, or there's a splash hazard, you have to wear goggles. Lab coats, goggles, and gloves must not be removed from the lab. You do need to take them off before you leave the lab, but they are kept in the lab. The gloves, if if you do not have any microbes on them and you haven't accidentally touched some microorganisms, they can be discarded in the regular trash can. However, if you know that there are microorganisms on the gloves, discard them in the biohazard container. Any question about that? Suppose you are working with the culture and you don't know if you got microorganisms on your gloves. Where should you discard your gloves after the end of the lab? In the trash can, the biohazard container, or some other place? Come on, you got at least a 33% chance here. Somebody guess. Where she'll get is wrong. Nobody wants to guess. You guys need to participate in the lab. Okay? If I give somebody an extra credit point if you get it right, will you then give a guess?
I would err on the side of caution and put them in the biohazard if I was unsure.
That's correct. If you're unsure, just err on the side of caution, put them in the biohazard place. I can't even see who was talking there, so
It was
go
me.
ahead and just email me and I'll get you that extra credit point, okay?
Thank you.
All right. Where was I? Oh, talking about gloves. Shoes have to fully enclose the foot. Goggles have to be worn when there's a splash hazard. Oh, I already talked about that. Sorry. Hands must be washed before you leave the lab with soap, and you should do that well for at least 20 seconds when you're doing the hand washing. Long hair should be tied back. We do have hair ties on the lab for your use. That includes males who have long hair, by the way. Absolutely no food or drink can be consumed in the lab at any time. No use of electronics in the lab at any time. At least personal electronics. We do actually have, I think it's an iPad for student use, and those iPads stay in the lab, so you can use them in the lab as long as, there it is. Couldn't get my cursor to show. As long as you have the iPad in the lab that we supply and it stays in the lab, we understand that it may be contaminated with microorganisms, and so that's why it stays in the lab. And that's for your use. You can email yourself notes and stuff like that. No cell phone, no personal items are allowed in the lab, with one exception, and that is if you're wearing it, you can bring it into the lab. All personal items are stored in the storage area, the cubicles by the main door. This cubicle area, as well as the main lab door, is considered outside of the lab proper. You then have to walk a few feet into the lab proper. Any personal items brought into the lab will be confiscated and returned to you only after they've been soaked in bleach for 15 minutes or autoclaved, and that will destroy anything electronic. This picture is extremely important. It's showing you what the student should look like when they come into a microbiology lab. So they should be wearing closed-toed shoes. They should be wearing a lab coat, which is fully buttoned up. They should be wearing gloves. You can't really see it well, but the person is wearing a hair tie or a hair net because the person has long glass, not long hair. I can't tell if the person is wearing goggles or these are personal eyewear. You are allowed to take your own glasses into the lab if you need eyewear. Just try not to touch them while you're in the lab. I think you can see maybe a necklace around the person. That's allowed into the lab. If the person has a watch, that would be allowed into the lab. The watch should be under the gloves. Any question about any of that? All right, this picture is important for one of the questions where the material is not in the lab module for the question, except for in this picture. So no food, no drinks, no cell phones, no headphones, whatever, are allowed in the lab, no electronics. Keep your work area clean and uncluttered. Disinfect your workstation before you begin any work in the lab. And then when you're all done at the end of the lab session, this is actually a picture of our lab. You won't go into it, but if you were to go into the microbiology lab, this is what it would look like. So there's the work area here. There's a chair for you to sit on. And yeah, they're not terribly comfortable. No back. There's a microscope there, but we don't normally keep them there. I'm not sure why that one's covered like that. That might be an instructor microscope. So regular trash, no sharp objects like scalpels, which we don't use, no contaminated items, no glass ever in the regular trash. The biohazard container shown here, put disposable petri dishes, disposable containers that are plastic. Do not put glass containers ever in the biohazard container. Contaminated test tubes, which are glass, put them in the test tube rack. Remove the tape. Slides, put them in the slide. Swabs, put them in the swab container, a slide container, and then a cover slip container. The cover slip container is separate because we do not wash a cover slip. They are put in disinfectant and then they are discarded in the broken glass container. Slides, though, we put them in disinfectant and then they will be washed and then reused. The swabs are just put in disinfectant and then probably put in the trash can. If you're unsure how to dispose of something, ask your instructor. We don't really have containers like that, but if you did use something like that, just put them next to the test tubes. Report all spills or accidents, no matter how slight. Cover the material with paper towels, drench the area affected with disinfectant, allow it to soak for 15 minutes to kill the microbes, and then clean up the area with dry paper towels. No mouth pipetting. Do not place anything in your mouth while you're in the lab, including your fingers, your nails, a pencil. And that's actually true for any item orifice in the face. You don't want to touch your eyes or your nose or even inside your ear. So if you have a itchy ear, you really don't want to scratch it. Not until you taking off your gloves, taking off your lab coat, go to the sink, wash your hands, and then you can scratch your ear. And then you need to go wash your hands, put on your lab coat, put on your gloves, and then return to your work. So you wouldn't want to do that. I already mentioned don't leave Bunsen burner or back-to incinerators turned off when not in use. The exception is with the back-to incinerator, if you're going to come back to it within like about a half an hour, you can leave it on because it'll take 5 minutes to warm up. You use the Bunsen burner or the back-to incinerator to sterilize equipment you're going to work with, like a loop shown here and here. And what you do is you heat the loop to sterilize it and then use the sterile loop. You should become familiar with the fire alarm, the first aid kit, the deluge shower. Trying to get that. There it goes. The eye wash station, the fire blanket shown here, the fire extinguisher shown here. This is fire safety equipment we have in each lab. You don't need to know where it is because we're never going to go in the lab. But you do need to know that these are the safety equipment. All right, so complete the lab exercise. It's a separate file. I've already gone over this in the syllabus, so I won't go over it again. Now, here's what I might not have mentioned. Consider all cultures you're working with to be potentially pathogenic. Even if they are not pathogenic, you won't know that unless it's, something that's labeled, like Micrococcus luteus. If it's labeled that, you should treat it as if it's potentially micropathogenic, even though it is not pathogenic. All right, that's it. Let's go on to the worksheet. Lab worksheet 0. Here is the lab safety worksheet. Fill in the answer in each asterisk. Don't bother removing the asterisks. It'll only confuse you. Put in an answer for each asterisk. So rule 1 requires 1, 2, 3, 4 different answers. In the lab, what do you always wear for safety before you enter the lab? This is not directly stated in the lab, but it is shown in a picture. So it's the picture I showed you. And then rule 2, after you enter the lab, what 2 items do you put on to keep yourself safe in the lab? Here's a question for you. Could you put a lab coat in rule 1 and in rule 2?
No.
It's either yes or no. Didn't hear an answer.
No.
No.
No,
Unless it's the first
because a
time.
lab coat, you wouldn't put it on before you enter the lab, and then you wouldn't put it on again after you enter the lab. Okay, I mentioned in the lab, Alina, that normally this is working a little differently. I don't normally get to see a text message, so you probably shouldn't use text messages. However, it looks like they might have changed this where now I'm able to see it. So maybe in the future I'll change that. But anyway, that's actually wrong. So you do not put the lab coat on both before you enter the lab and then put it on a second time after you enter the lab. That doesn't even make sense. You only put the lab coat on after you enter the lab, which will be for most labs and most circumstances. The only time you'd ever put it on before you enter the lab would only be if you bought a lab coat from the bookstore and then it's the very first lab, you could put it on before you enter the lab. However, every other lab, you'll put it on after you enter the lab. So that's actually the correct answer for a lab coat. So the questions have to make sense. Okay. The questions are in the lab module, although this one, rule 1, You got to get it from the picture because it's not directly stated in the lab. And if there's ever a question which is not in the lab module, I will state it or it'll be stated in the question. It says look up lab safety data sheet online because you can't get this information from the lab module. So find out what one is. And then each chemical in the lab has a safety data sheet, STS, that describes what. So provide at least a phrase for each answer, meaning one word answers are unacceptable. So give me 5 different things that the safety data sheet describes about a chemical. And you should be answering a generic answer so it would work for any chemical, meaning sodium hydroxide, liquid sodium hydroxide. Something it tells you is if it gets on the skin, it'll burn you. Well, that's true. This isn't a correct answer, but it's not correct for every chemical. It's only correct for some chemicals. And you should be having a generic answer where this information from the safety data sheet can apply for any chemical. Any question about any of that? So this one, you do need to look online, get your answer, and you need to supply 5 answers. If you simply erase that asterisk, I know how many are in rule 3, and so I'll know you erased an answer, and so it'll only confuse you. So don't erase the asterisks. Rule 4, name 5 items of safety equipment found in the lab. Can anyone name one piece of safety equipment found in the lab?
Fire extinguisher.
Yeah, good. Fire extinguisher. Rule 5, name 2 items that you can take into the lab. These 2 items could be mentioned in rule 1. They don't have to be, but they could be. So that's the first 2 asterisks. And then the third asterisk, can you eat or drink in the lab? And that one should be pretty easy. It's either yes or no. Put that in the third asterisk. And then 2, list 1 item of laboratory attire you must wear in a microbiology lab. This can be a repeat from either rule 1 or rule 2. And then 3, list 1 item belonging to you that is allowed to be brought into a microbiology lab. So this would be a personal item of yours that you can bring into the microbiology lab. And then 4, list 1 item belonging to you that is not allowed in a microbiology lab. And then 5, submit this file by 8 a.m. Friday of week 1 in the folder for worksheet lab 00, or you will be dropped from the class. I'm going to use this worksheet as well as worksheet 1 to take attendance for the first week, and then state who's attending the class and who's not, and turning that into the registrar's office. And they will drop whoever is not attending the class. Any question about any of that?
No.
Oh, I got new questions. Let's see what's here. That should be above 5 here. Okay, here we go. So 1, what must be worn when working in the microbiology lab? 2, what should not be worn when working in the microbiology lab? 3, when are you required to wear protective goggles in the microbiology lab? And 4, what should never be done when working with and disposing of chemicals, reagents in the microbiology lab? Five, when are food and drinks and cell phones allowed in the microbiology lab? All right, any question about that? Let me see if you have those new questions. in the,
They're not in the one on the canvas.
okay. Then I'm going to state you don't need to answer those, but you may answer those because I need to update that. Which I'll do. All right, any questions? I just uploaded lab module 00, the worksheet, so you do have access to the new questions. If you have that on your worksheet, please answer those questions. If you don't, that's okay.